Harry Braverman talks about the impact of capitalism on work and on people, and how they think about themselves and how they develop identities. Now, he doesn't talk so much about identity in his work, but it can be extrapolated in such a way to really think about what it means to be de-skilled, which is one of his main points. So here in this book, a large part of Braverman's argument centers on the de-skilling of jobs as a systematic effort to more efficiently control and coordinate the labor force, right? And this is a task that's identical to the task that Marx set himself in the first volume of Capital. But the value of Braverman's work is that it really does talk about more modern contexts. What happens when we want to accumulate capital? If I want to maximize profitability and accumulate capital as a capitalist, I want the worker to be the most efficient. So here's the psychological and the social psychological pattern that Braverman lays out. 3 things are necessary. First, you have to separate workers from the means of production. So you have to enable workers to only do a piece of what they're doing. They're not a whole being, they're only a part. The second thing you have to do is you have to allow the worker to sell their labor willingly. And then you have to enable workers to really want to be a part of this, to increase their investment into the whole system. So the idea behind the success of capitalism, or the success of a company in this sense, is that you would, as a worker, want to be de-skilled. Well, you don't want to be de-skilled, but you know that you get money by being de-skilled. And what that means is that you no longer know how to make a whole garment. You don't even know what a whole garment or a coat looks like. You no longer know what a whole car looks like or operates like. I mean, of course you don't, you know what it looks like, but you're only doing one part, and you do it so repetitively that your mind is separated from your hands. That's the key. That your mind is separated from your hand. And that large-scale de-skilling creates a populace that is no longer able to bring their whole body to work because they have been de-skilled. They don't have skills to bring to the next job because they can only move their hand. So they're only capable of doing one certain thing. So it kind of locks us into this capitalist pattern, blah, blah. Okay, so let me move on a little bit later, because what happens then is that we start to then recognize that humans are actually humans and that they aren't just cogs in a wheel. And so then we think about workers as individuals with personalities. And if you have a personality, then you have both internal motivation for going to work and external motivations, like payment of wages is the most obvious external consideration. So then in the 30s, we start to really focus on identity and motivation, because what we want to know is who is the person such that we can motivate them to work harder, because we realize that just de-skilling them isn't working, and people work for unexpected reasons, and it turns out that they surprise us a lot, and no matter how much we pay them, they might still work slowly. So there seems to be this odd thing called informal communication in the workplace, where people might be talking to each other and they might actually be functioning with real personalities, and then they might have actual uprisings and protest their work conditions. So what we need to do is then motivate them. Right now, so here's a linchpin and then I'm going to slow down on my talk about work and move over to identity. Because at the same time then, and in large response to this idea of, we need to manage people, the field of psychology emerges. Now, of course, I come from an organizational work perspective, so of course this is my version of history, but it's not a coincidence that psychology emerges at the same time that management needs to learn about the psychological makeup of their human workers. So now, we're not just looking at labor as a process of physical movement or physical labor. We're talking about labor as also involving the mind and also involving a personality and a desire or a motivation to work harder. So let me now shift just for a minute back to the discussion of identity in the 20th century that influences this view, particularly in the symbolic interactionist tradition. So leave for a moment the workplace, where we now have workers who have personalities and whose identities want to be managed by the boss. We're going to leave that behind, and we'll go now to thinking about a little bit of the symbolic interactionist tradition, because along this, in parallel to this issue, to this interest in managing workers, we also have a lot of people who are interested in what makes, what gives us personalities in the first place, what gives us social structures, and how can we think differently about those. There's a lot of influences on why we're talking about these issues, not the least of which has to do with the, sort of what comes up to World War II. So let me just briefly give you a list of who the all-male panel of symbolic interactionists are. Mostly we think of these as being the fathers of symbolic interactionism, and so if you're interested in this kind of way of thinking, these are some of the authors that are key. The first is Charles Cooley, who wrote Human Nature and the Social Order in 1902, and he uses for the first time the term the looking glass self. How many of you have studied the looking glass self at all? Okay, looking glass self is great because, well, I'm just going to go through these as a list and then we can talk a little bit more about it. Martin Buber is an Austrian philosopher who studied dialogue, and he wrote a lot of essays on existence as an encounter. And so he is an interesting person to read in this context because he has a notion of that we are not individuals at all. We are only in relation with each other. So that the ideal state of humanness is an I-thou, not just I. And what that recognizes is that only by being with others can we even have a self. This is also part of the looking glass theory, where Charles Cooley says the other is a mirror, and I see myself in the mirror that the other presents to me. And so I only know what the mirror is in how you look at me, or what I see you seeing in me. Does that make sense? So when I look out there, if I see somebody sleeping, for example, if I saw somebody snoring, then that would be a mirror that says something about me to me, right? And then I'm going to say, oh, maybe I'm a boring person, right? Now, I might also say something about that person who's sleeping, but in a way that what we're doing then, when we start to think about the relationship instead of the individual, is that we're starting to see it as an interaction. That it's only by when I look at you that I understand who I am. And then I'm not even sure who I am, because then I'm going to try to get some verification from you. Hey, dude, are you really sleeping? Right? Like so. Then he or she will say, no, I'm just resting my eyes. You're not boring at all. And then I realize, oh, I'm not boring. But by virtue of communication, we are learning what is real. That's the bottom line thinking of symbolic interactionism, at least when it comes to thinking about reality. Another author whose work wasn't really available to most of us until it was translated from Russian into English in I think the 80s. Yeah, in the 80s. But it would be Mikhail Bakhtin who talks about the dialogic as being the very essential part of being, that we are in relation through virtue of constant and ongoing dialogues. the most famous, probably, of all the symbolic interactionists that you would ever hear of would be George Herbert Mead and Herbert Blumer. Herbert Blumer was it Herbert? Herbert Blumer? Herbert Blumer, yeah. And George Herbert Mead? Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. I always get those screwed up. I've been studying that for 25, 30 years. Okay, so Mead was a teacher to Blumer, and Blumer sort of took over and became sort of the founding father, in a way, of symbolic interactionism by virtue of a book he wrote by the same title, Symbolic Interactionism. And so he, and then often we hear about Goffman in these same lines. They're really focusing on what is it that makes us come to a sense of self, and how do we understand other. And this is, they say, through a process of symbolic exchange. I'll get a little bit into more detail in a moment. Also recognizable here, you might notice anthropologist Gregory Bateson, who wrote many pieces related to this. And then Stryker, McCall, and Simmons, who were actually writing much later, but who focus on particular kinds of symbolic interactionisms. One that is, in the case of Stryker, thinking about how structures impose on how we understand our identity and relation, and then McCall and Simmons, who talk about the interesting aspect of the dramaturgical model, which is to say we improvise, and then we get validation on our improvisations over time. And then we come to understand ourselves through that acting process. So these are just names that, if you are interested in symbolic interactionism, you would want to recognize. Herbert Blumer